Okay, can everyone see this thing that says meetings a sprint or a marathon on top?
Yes.
All right, meeting minutes. Just a little background. I've been the secretary and the treasurer of various organizations. I'm not particularly a good treasurer. I mean, I can keep books, but that's not very handy. But I do serve as secretary of a number of organizations. It's not as easy as it sounds because, minutes need to be pretty accurate. And there's a lot of discussion as to what should be in minutes and how long they should be and so forth and so on. So we'll cover a few of those things. Minutes can be looked at in different ways also. They can be looked at, for example, as part of the history of an organization. You read their minutes as they've met, let's say 11 or 12 times a year, and it gives you a pretty good idea of what the organization's about and so forth and so on. But they're also very much a legal document. And I wanted to talk about that just a little bit. But they're the official record of an organization. What does that mean? The official record, it certainly means that there needs to be some kind of record of what organizations do. And the set of minutes actually serves as that formal record. The second bullet point probably is one of the more interesting ones and the one that's often abused, and that is it's what's done at a meeting and not what's said by the members. And let me give you an example from my background. As Lucy said, I worked a lot in hospitals. Every year, well, let me background. Hospitals have boards of directors, of course, and they have committees of the board. And at the hospitals where I've worked, usually there's an executive secretary who actually takes the minutes at the board meetings. It's a staff member, and also at the committees. We have an executive take care of those minutes. Every year we had our legal staff come in and talk to the executive secretaries about how to take minutes. And one of the most important things is, when do you actually use a person's name? Do you say that John Smith said this and this and this? Or do you just simply say, this was, when do you have any discussion in minutes? When do you just have, well, in any case, this is something that we did very seriously every year. We trained our secretaries as to what to include in minutes and what not to include in minutes. And usually there's no good reason to say why a person said that. And why is this the case? Minutes can be looked at as a legal document, and they can be actually taken, to court. Now, this is not going to happen in most nonprofits, but this is more of an extreme example. But minutes are important enough that somebody could use those minutes against you and say, I see in your minutes so-and-so said this, this is very inappropriate. They should not have said that, or whatever. So generally speaking, you don't say what's said by people. There are some exceptions, but we'll talk about that a little bit. Also, minutes should not ever reflect the secretary's opinion. In other words, the secretary shouldn't say that, this is very good or this is not so good. So it's to be very, very neutral. The secretary is a neutral, scribe of what the organization's been doing. Another way of looking at what should be in the minutes is, who is the audience for the minutes? Are they the people who are actually at the meeting? Are they members who are not at the meeting? And the reason I mention that is because some secretaries feel that the minutes should be a little bit more than what was actually just done. In other words, you don't just list all of the motions that were adopted or defeated. And that's pretty much the whole set of minutes. Because if you're at the meeting, you don't really know a whole lot about the meeting if that's all you have. The other extreme, which I've seen in some organizations, is they'll actually have a recording of everything that was said during a particular meeting and who said it. That's not really a set of minutes, but that's the other extreme where you have everything as opposed to only what was done in a meeting. When I say your audience, I know when I'm secretary, I don't follow Robert's absolutely as gospel. I hate to say that, being Robert myself, but usually I'll put a little more detail in the minutes than just what was done or what had happened, just so people could have a little bit of an idea if they weren't at the meeting, or if they want to look at the minutes 6 months from now, have a little better idea of what kind of things were done and so forth and so forth. Of course, the minutes from a from a point of view of format, they of course need to have the name of the organization, the date, the time, the place of the meeting, the motions and the names of the makers motions, but not who does the second. And that's from Roberts. In other words, you do list John made the motion to whatever the motion is, but you don't say who did the second. You do include the results of votes, especially, was it adopted or not adopted? And then the secretary doesn't ever say respectfully submitted anymore. These are things that used to be said in the old days, but you don't do that anymore. That's kind of in the past. And then you include the date of a draft, because often minutes are approved. And as had been said before, they're not approved by a motion. The chair will say, are there any corrections to the minutes? They'll be accepted as distributed. Or if there are a couple of corrections that are suggested, the chair will say the minutes are adopted as corrected, but there's no vote taken on it. But you often will have a draft of the minutes before the next meeting when they're actually approved, and then you have the date that they're actually approved. So basically, those are the kind of things you think about as far as the minutes. Who the audience? How much detail do you want in the minutes? Should the minutes include some discussion of something that's fairly controversial, or not have any discussion? What about reports? The reports, for example, in most meetings, the officers will make reports. The president will give a summary of things that are important to him or her, or things that he or she had done. The secretary usually summarizes some of these reports that are done by officers or by committees. A committee will make a report. You don't simply just say the committee made a report. You'd probably want to put a little information about, what the committee reported without going into a huge amount of detail. But does all this make sense, as far as who your audience is? If all you do is what Robert says and have only what was done and what was actually happened, then the minutes would be very, very short, and they wouldn't tell you a whole lot. They'd be a great legal record, but they wouldn't say a whole lot about the organization or what they're doing. Are there any questions about the minutes at this point before we go any further?
There is a question about whether slides are acceptable instead of reports.
I mean, during a meeting, could the president use slides instead of, I'm sorry, what was the question one more time?
The question says, are slides acceptable instead of reports all off? So yes, I think the question is whether an officer or reporting member of a committee can use a slideshow for their report.
I wouldn't see any reason that it could not be done. In fact, at a fairly recent meeting that I was at, the president, in order to make sure that they covered what they wanted to, put a slide up for all of us to see and said, these are the 4 or 5 points that I want to make sure I cover. And so, yes, an officer can use a PowerPoint or a slide, to give their report, or just to even have a few notes as to what the report will cover. But yes, it can be done that way. Thinking about what Robert says, many sets of minutes are only 1 page long, if you follow Roberts literally. And I've seen most minutes, for a meeting that takes place for an hour, for example, to be 2 or 3 pages, because there's a little more detail that's included. And what I have for everyone, although I'm not quite sure how this is going to work, I do have 3 things as handouts. One is just a set of minutes that's a good, valid set of minutes, just so you can see exactly what it looks like. The second one is a bad set of minutes that has a lot of flaws in it. And the bad set of minutes, there are quite a few things that are wrong. And so the third thing I have for you as a handout is the key to what's wrong with those minutes that are bad. They have line numbers on the left side, and so you can go through them and say, yep, this is wrong and this is wrong because of this, and it's on this particular line. So those will be available to people if they'd like. The nice set of minutes, also the bad set of minutes, and also the answers are the key to the set of minutes.
And Robert, I'm loading those into the chat right now, and I can send them by email to everybody. So,
okay, if people are interested, we certainly, do we have people's emails?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So we assume that those will be in the chat area?
Momentarily.
Momentarily. Okay, if there's nothing else on minutes at this point, we will now move to.
We do actually have some more. We do actually have some more questions that came in, Robert.
Okay, I'll wait.
So the first one is whether names of committee members should be included in the minutes.
I would not necessarily include the names of the committee members in the minutes, with one exception. If a committee is being formed, let's say the chair says, or I'm sorry, the person who makes a motion says, I'd like to establish a committee to look at this, have John Jones as the chair and Sally Smith and somebody else, as members. In that case, you would have the names of the people who are in the committee. In the minutes generally, though, if the committee member, you don't list the committee's members, but you would have the person normally to chair the committee. That person's name would be in there, but not the committee members generally. Does that make sense?
I think so. And then the next question was, how should a secretary handle an oral report when it is all over the place?
That's really up to the chair. But the secretary, as I think was said a little bit earlier, since the secretary is trying to keep track of things, they can, in a small meeting, they can say, would you please repeat what you said? I'm not quite sure I'm following that. In a larger meeting, you could ask the chair, to intervene a little bit and get the person back more on track. But it depends on what you're trying to record also, because if the person is just making a report all over the place, you aren't going to include a whole lot of that information anyway in the minutes, just the high points.
And then we had another question that came in. Wouldn't committee member names be in the committee report, and are reports attached to the minutes?
Reports are sometimes attached to the minutes, especially if that's requested. What was the part about the committee? I'm sorry, would you repeat one more time?
Wouldn't committee member names be in the committee report?
They could be, but they don't necessarily have to be. I mean, I guess if I were a committee chair, I would probably include them. If I were doing a written report that was going to be attached to the minutes, I would certainly want to list who's on the committee besides me.
Okay, and that's all the questions we've got for now.
Okay. Then I guess we will move on to bylaws, if that's good for everyone. Bylaws. As was stated earlier, they are a contract. They're a contract between an organization and the state, and also a contract between the officers and the members. What does that mean? That means this is how we're going to be doing business. This is how we're going to take care of things. And, it's kind of it's a written contract which is quite interesting because so many people don't actually look at the bylaws, partially because they don't know where they are, but they don't see necessarily what the value is. And let me tell you, being part of the three organizations that Lucy mentioned, you know, the Northern Lights parliamentarians, the St. Paul parliamentarians, and also the state parliamentarian chapter, I have bylaws for all three. And so it sounds kind of funny, but all three of the bylaws are not identical. Even though these are all parliamentary organizations, the two units, you know, the St. Paul unit and the Northern Lights, you'd think they would be very similar, and they are similar in many, many ways, but they're also very different in very, very ways. So I find value in having the bylaws simply because it helps me understand how things are done. You know, besides having things that are very useful, like agendas and things like that, how do you know, what the officers are supposed to be doing? You know, how do you know what the job is of a particular person? These are all the kinds of things that are in the bylaws of an organization. As it said, it sets forth the nature of and the rules and regulations adopted to govern the organization and to regulate how it functions. Now, if you've never seen the bylaws of an organization, how do you know what kinds of things are, how do you know these things? I suppose by osmosis, if you go to their meetings, but also, this is all things you can find in an organization's bylaws. Also, bylaws make something unique. As I mentioned, I'm in two different parliamentary units, and each one is unique from the other. And how do you know that? From what's in the bylaws, how they go about doing certain things. And as it said before, it's a contract between an organization and its members, just like it's a contract between the organization and the state. They should be no more restrictive or no more detailed than necessary, which is kind of interesting, as you're saying both restrictive, but not too restrictive. Now, the content of the bylaws is taken right from Roberts. In other words, you have the name of the organization, what its objectives and purposes are, who the members are. How do you know who the members of an organization are? What do you have to do to become a member? Often you need to pay dues in an organization in order to be considered an active member. If you don't pay dues, it's a good way, you were probably not considered a member, or you lose your membership. Officers and their duties. I think this is one of the more important parts of almost any set of bylaws. And that is, how do you go about, what is the job of the secretary, for example, or the treasurer, or parliamentarian, and any number of officers and so forth? What are their duties? It's very, very easy to find those. It's important to find those in the bylaws. How often does the organization meet? Their regular meetings, their annual meetings, sometimes they'll have a special meeting. How is the special meeting actually put together? Who can put together a meeting? How are they called? Who's on the board of directors? And what is their authority? Sometimes boards of directors have authority to do things between meetings. Sometimes they have authorities to do certain things that don't need to actually be ratified later by the membership. Sometimes all they do is certain things in an emergency, and they can be ratified later by the membership. But in each case, these should be specified in your bylaws. What does the board do, and what authority does it have? And then there's usually an executive committee, of maybe just 3 or 4 of the key officers. What is its? And then a list of committees. Remember, we've talked several times about standing committees versus special committees. The standing committees are listed in the bylaws. In other words, you might have a standing committee that would be, well, can't think of an example off the top of my head, but the standing committees would be ones to be listed in the bylaws that they're going to always exist, and they usually have a function that happens during the year. A special committee would be established, by either by the president or by a motion from one of the members who, for a specific purpose, and that committee would probably go out of existence after a while. But the list of committees, should be in there. Parliamentary authority, I find that interesting. That became a question, that David also handled. To me, a set of bylaws should have what is the parliamentary authority. And this is interesting because I'll tell you another thing. I'm in a condominium, and a condominium has very, very unusual rules. One of the rules, for example, is we talk about one member, one vote. That's not true in a condominium. The amount of votes that we get depends on how big our apartment is and how many units that we have for our cars. And so because we have a 2-bedroom apartment and we have only one place to put cars, we have 0.85 of a vote, not one vote, but 0.85. The other thing that's interesting about it is that since we don't own it completely, we still have a little bit of a mortgage. The mortgagee, in other words, the bank, also has a vote, which is very odd, I think. In any case, that's how it's done. But the reason I mention that is that when I've gone to board meetings of our own, board of directors of our units here, there is no parliamentary authority. And so I did ask, I said, let's go ahead and put in Robert's rules. And so they had a vote about that. When that vote is done, it's done by ballot. It's done, it was resoundingly defeated by 80%. 80% of people said, no, we don't want Robert's rules. So I finally asked some people later, I said, why didn't we want to have Robert's rules? Shouldn't we have some authority? They said, if you ever want to kill a meeting, have Robert's rules be used. And so what that person told me, even though they didn't say it specifically, is they'd been to a meeting where somebody knew a lot of the ins and outs of Roberts, and they got a lot of things done in their way, but that didn't fit well with anybody else. And so they don't see Robert's rules as a way of having good meetings, but it's a way of, manipulating meetings, which I thought was really too bad. And so our Economist Association does not have any parliamentary authority. And then, how they're amended. Usually bylaws need to be amended by a 2/3 majority. They usually also have to be amended by a notice. You don't spring on whoever's doing the voting at that meeting that we're going to be amending the bylaws. You usually do that with a certain amount of notice, so everybody who's interested in those bylaws knows that's going to happen. They can be at the meeting, and when the vote is taken, it's usually a 2/3, because bylaws are very serious. They're meant to be fairly unchangeable. I mean, they certainly can be changed and amended. Don't misunderstand me, but they're meant to be fairly fixed, and so you don't amend them lightly. Even though there's some very good reasons, as Miriam said, if they contradict each other or if they have bad language, whatever, there are a lot of good reasons. But if they're a good set of bylaws, they don't get amended very often.
Robert,
Yes.
I hate to interrupt, but we're at time.
Oh, my heavens.
I know,
And
I think you
I
missed
was
my 5 minutes, but you can have a riveting extra 1 minute.
Well, I guess I'm a big believer in things that are in writing, whether they're minutes, whether they're the minutes that really tell the history of the organization, or whether the bylaws, which really tell you an awful lot about how an organization should be functioning. And so I find a lot of value in both of those. And I guess I'm waxing too eloquently. I didn't realize I'd be using that much time. I thought I'd have a lot more time, but thank you very much for listening.